Kia ora, good morning everybody. My name's Harvey Brooks from Wellbeing Waikato. Welcome again to our Waikato Affordable Energy webinar series. Today we're really thrilled to have guests from the Infrastructure Commission joining us talking about their recent publication on electricity in New Zealand. I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping to start with and then start us with a karakia, a little bit of background and then hand over to our guests. So just a karakia to start us, he karakia. Whakataka tahau ki te uru, whakataka tahau ki te tonga, kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e he yaki ana ta atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhunga, haumia hui e, taiki e. All right, if you're joining us, we are recording these webinars and they will be published on our website. So if you're not comfortable with your image being recorded, please turn off your video now. Also, please, unless you're a presenter, please mute your microphone so that there's no background. If you have a question or a comment, please put it in the chat and we will refer those to the presenters at the end of the presentation, and if we have any spare time, we will open the floor for live questions. If you do have a live question, please put up your digital hand so that I know you have the question and I can come to you and ask that. All right, so just a little bit of background to start with before we get in. And before I do that also, I'd just like to also introduce my co-host, Ernie Newman, who has a significant and storied career in competition and infrastructure in New Zealand and is also a proud resident of the Waikato. And so Ernie's very generously agreed to join this series, and he will provide some reflections and comments at the end of the Q&A. If you're joining us for the first time today, Wellbeing Waikato, we're an independent charitable trust. Our role is to gather and share regional intelligence about what's most important to households and whānau from a wellbeing point of view and identify emerging risks and opportunities early. We try and support others to surface underlying drivers and not just symptoms, and we work alongside and convene with government iwi, councils, community organisations and the public around decision useful insights. And you can see on the slide there some of the reports that we've prepared over the last few years, which relate to things like food availability and affordability, housing affordability, the state of wellbeing in the Waikato region, and wellbeing as it is defined in different communities of the Waikato. So that's all available, freely available on our website. We've become particularly interested, along with a lot of other people, in the electricity system in New Zealand. Part of that is obviously related to the affordability of that, but I think also it's fair to say that most people as consumers of electricity have little or no understanding how that system works. And so we've, like a lot of people, been looking at the concept of the energy trilemma, where electricity energy needs to be affordable, reliable and sustainable. And achieving all of those three things is the great challenge, not only for New Zealand, but around the world, especially as we transition to a more sustainable energy source or system. So we've asked a range of speakers the same four big questions, and this is what Graham and Pippa will be reflecting on today as well. Firstly, how does the electricity system actually work and why is it designed the way it is? What drives our power prices and can they be made more affordable? And how does energy affordability affect household and community well-being? And then ultimately, what would a better system look like and how will we get there? This series started in early June and will finish in early November. Just a really quick recap on some of the slides and insights that we've seen. This was an initial model shared with us by Jeff Bertram. It actually is a model developed by MB showing the way the system is at the moment, and it moves more or less from the left to the right, from the big generation systems through transmission, through retailers and distributors, through to domestic users. And Jeff pointed out that the system is operated closer to the remote part of the system here on the left by Transpower at present. This slide's available, you can have a look at your leisure, but he's proposed a much more distributed system, taking advantage of the technology developments there are right now, which allow for generation and storage of energy much closer to where it is used, whether that be homes, industry, or farms. And he was proposing a more locally controlled system around electricity as well. And a very, very simple summation of that was this diagram here, where the top one is what we have at the moment. Lots of remote generation, remote meaning it's generated a long, long way away from where it's actually used, and transmission, and very little in the way of distributed energy to the retail market, and moving to one where we still have remote generation and transmission as is needed to keep the system firm, but that is complemented by a lot more distributed generation into the retail market. Last week, we heard from Matt Newman from Rewiring Aotearoa, and his presentation was absolutely fantastic and is online now as well. And he talked about making 6 good decisions over the next 10 years. And I've adulterated that and made it 7 as well. And I'll just explain that in a second. So the 6 good decisions, this is much more from the point of view of the household, solar energy, heat pump hot water, electric vehicles, heat pumps, induction or non-gas cooking, and a battery. I've added in there too an electric mower because I think that's probably one of the easiest and quickest things we can all do, not only to save a bit of petrol, but an enormous amount of time. There are dozens of others as well, but I thought that was a really practical way to talk about what we can all do as individuals to electrify, and not only do that, but to save ourselves an enormous amount of money over the lifetime of those household assets. So there's some patterns definitely emerging through our presentations, and you can go to the website and check out all those presentations and the slides at your leisure. Okay, so it's my great pleasure now to welcome Graham and Pippa from the Infrastructure Commission to join us today. Just a quick introduction to them both. Graham is the Director of Economics and Research at the Commission. He has an impressive background in macroeconomics, fiscal policy and forecasting, having worked for the Bank of Canada, the IMF and the State of Vermont Legislative Fiscal Office. At the Commission, Graham's work focuses on forecasting future infrastructure needs and providing advice around infrastructure funding and financing, local government issues, and the link between economic growth and infrastructure investment. He holds a master's degree in public affairs with an economics concentration from no less than Princeton University, and an undergraduate degree in economics from the Centre College, which is in Kentucky in the United States. So welcome, Graham. And secondly, Pippa, who's the Principal Advisor of Policy at the Infrastructure Commission. She is a regulatory and strategy specialist with over 25 years experience working in both the public and private sectors in New Zealand, the UK and Australia. She originally trained and qualified as a chartered minerals surveyor. I never knew there was such a thing, Pippa, in the UK, before moving to New Zealand, where she has focused on land, environment and infrastructure management. More recently, Pippa applied her understanding on how law and policy interfaces with operations by completing a master's degree in law from Victoria University. And energy is one of the policy areas that Pippa covers for the Commission. It's a huge honour to have you both here today. You were invited with relatively short notice, so I'm so grateful that you've taken that opportunity. Your presentation fits perfectly into this series, and so it's a great honour to have you here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass over to you. Kia ora.
Thank you so much, Harvey, for that great introduction and an overview of the program and what you've already heard. It sounds like a very ambitious program, and we're happy to be a part of it. I'll let Pippa pull up our slides so we can get started. Can everyone see okay? Sharing? Great. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here today to present our most recent research insights paper on the energy sector, entitled "Shifting Currents and the Energy Infrastructure in Transition." In many ways, thinking about your introduction, Harvey, the Infrastructure Commission is kind of on the same journey that Wellbeing Waikato is on. This work was designed to build out the Commission's evidence base for policy advice within government around the energy sector, but also to provide a bit more commentary on some of the work that we did for the National Infrastructure Plan, which was released a couple months ago, which spent a fair amount of time exploring issues within the energy sector, And so this paper is designed to kind of flush out that bit of thinking, but also help us build evidence and maturity around the issues in the sector going forward. And so a lot of the questions that you highlighted in your introduction, Harvey, are very similar to what we explored in the paper. Things like, what does that long-term transition look like, and what is infrastructure specific role? What can we do to ensure that energy infrastructure is meeting New Zealanders' long-term needs in an affordable and sustainable way? And so this is kind of similar to the first, second, and fourth question that you highlighted earlier. And so again, we're delighted to be here talking about it. And so the way this conversation is going to go is I'll turn it over to Pippa to talk a bit about some of the context and the background for the paper and how the electricity system was built over time. Then I'll talk a bit about kind of short and long-term dynamics. So what's been happening to prices since 2019, and then a longer-term view about how we achieve our long-term emissions goals in the energy sector. And then Pippa will conclude with some key observation and implications that hold kind of across both time periods, and then we can take some questions at the end. So I will turn it over to Pippa to talk about some of the background.
Kia ora koutou, ko Pippa Player tōku ingoa. Hi, I'm Pippa Player, and I work with Graham and the team here at Waihanga. I guess the first thing to do is set some context about who we are and what we do. So Waihanga, New Zealand Infrastructure Commission, has a unique role in the New Zealand infrastructure system. Our main statutory function is to develop an approach to infrastructure that improves the well-being of New Zealanders. But for that approach, we also develop broad public agreement. So our focus is very much on infrastructure in the long term, and we take a system view across all sectors, as Graham pointed out. But we're not necessarily technical experts in the energy sector, but energy has featured strongly in our strategy, our 2022 National Infrastructure Strategy, and also our National Infrastructure Plan, which Graham mentioned was published in February. So this paper, our Shifting Currents paper, is a contribution to our ongoing work, and it provides that baseline evidence, as Graham also mentioned. But it doesn't necessarily focus on short-term policy solutions, because that's not necessarily our role. So we also appreciate that some of our analysis won't be new to you, but we think that there might be some useful insights to show you how the system may need to adapt to further needs in the longer term. So I'm just going to cover a little bit about what our National Infrastructure Plan, the main thrust of it, relation to energy, the energy sector. So what we've noticed and why we've focused on energy now is that energy is foundational. It underpins economic growth, resilience, and our ability to meet net zero commitments. So our National Infrastructure Plan and our priorities in Recommendation 14, which is flashed up there on the screen, shows that. But also, the sector is under real pressure. There's a significant change and projected growing demand from decarbonisation over the next 30 years. And also, electricity use is projected to grow roughly around 60% by 2050. Which will require some sustained investment in infrastructure, but also stable policy settings. So if we are to meet our emissions goals, our emissions reduction goals, our forward guidance considers that significant investment in new electricity generation, storage, and networks will be needed in the long term. And without a sustained investment, and that sustained investment and policy certainty, there are risks of constraining economic growth and the decarbonisation pathway. Just want to cover off the core areas that are in our Shifting Currents paper that provides a more in-depth view of the sector, and we explore how New Zealand can deliver affordable energy, reliable supply, and lower emissions in the long term. Something that's very obviously a core area within the Wellbeing Waikato work programme. So our paper looks at short and long run challenges and has led to 4 interrelated observations around policy: the need for stable policy to support long-term investment, the need for more low-cost generation to bring prices down in the long term, how the system needs to be flexible and adaptable, and how important that will be in the longer term, but also how the system and the players will need to adapt as that energy transition progresses. Overall, we see that although the pathway is clear, the system needs certainty, clarity, and coordination. I'll next provide a little bit more context before Graham takes you through some of the more details of the paper. So New Zealand's got a long history in renewable energy. I think Jeff Bertram touched on some of this in his presentation. But where are we? Move the slide. So we've got a really long history. So energy infrastructure is one of New Zealand's largest infrastructure networks, with currently over $53 billion worth of assets. The chart shows that the capital investment in electricity and gas as a share of GDP between 1906 and 1922. Oh, sorry, 20. Oh, thank you, 2022. Gosh. So this is the chart's actually based on one of our technical papers from last year in terms of nation building, so looking at infrastructure in the long term. But what it also shows is that the first hydro scheme was in 1888 in Reefton, the South Island. And also the significant post-war boom period between 1947 and 1984, which is the grey blocked area within the chart. So during that period, there was a large-scale hydro and thermal development and a period of significant building and construction and significant government investment in power schemes, often in advance of demand growth. So during that time, you had the Huntly Power Station, you had Clyde Dam, you had various other different generation projects, which the country now relies on today. So it's a very, very important period in the history of development of electricity within the system, within our system in New Zealand. But during the I'm just going to flick that down. Sorry. But during the mid to late 1980s, there was major system reforms that introduced the current industry structure and wholesale market design. And Jeff Bertram did go through some of the current design in terms of that a couple of weeks ago. But also from there, oh gosh, I've used the wrong button. There you go. I think I should use that one here. So there was the first large-scale, grid-scale wind farm in 2004, and the first solar grid-scale solar scheme in 2023. But in addition, there's also been a series of energy crises. So we had the oil shocks in the 1970s. We had several dry years and hydro shocks, if you like, between the 1990s and the 2010s. But there's also been the domestic gas decline and further dry years in the 2020s. We also, in the paper, sort of set the scene for what does the structure of the sector look like. And we've taken very much a systems focus to give that context and to outline the various roles and functions in the system and how interconnected it is with other fuel sources, for example, gas, how gas and electricity are interrelated. This was a very strong influence on how challenges and frictions and opportunities and risks were considered in the paper. And it also helped us to see where focus might be needed in the future. So in our work, we look across many sectors, but we also consider the electricity sector is quite unique. The industry structure, which you can see on the left-hand column, covers around 7 layers from the fuel that supplies it all the way through to generation, the wholesale market, the transmission grid, the distribution grids, retailing, and consumers. There's multiple fuel sources which are shown in the pink row at the top. Multiple fuel sources for electricity generation. There's 151 generators, there's 30 distributors and around 40 retailers. And if you add in the government role in ownership and transmission, and generation and retailing, and also the government role in oversight and regulation of the industry. It's a really complex sector with lots and lots of players. So pulling one lever in isolation without considering impacts on others is unlikely to work too well. Just want to just cover off for a minute why New Zealand's electricity system is so unique. It also sets some context for how Graham will talk you through some of the issues that we've observed through in our paper. So compared with other countries, we see that there's, New Zealand's unique in sort of three ways. The way we generate low emissions, renewable-based electricity, as you can see on the chart on the left-hand side. Our mix of resources used for generation is quite different to other countries in the OECD. So our output also varies with the weather because it's highly renewable, and our electricity system really depends on flexibility. So the second area that makes us unique is also that our electricity networks are somewhat different compared with other countries. We are a long, skinny, rugged country with a small spread out population across two main islands. So our transmission network tends to be bigger than most other countries, and that reflects the long distance between our generation plant and where we consume energy. And our third sort of point of difference is that we've got no grid interconnections with other countries. We don't import or export electricity, and what we produce is what we use. So how we deal with peaks and troughs in that supply is up to us to solve, and we can't rely on our neighbours we can't rely on our neighbours at all, basically. So along with that complexity with the sector, that context means that New Zealand also has unique challenges in terms of providing and paying for infrastructure and services. So in the paper, we sort of point out there's not simple fixes and there's no silver bullets. But Graham will now take you through a little bit more of the detail of our analysis, and particularly relating to pricing trends and the challenges from generation from an infrastructure perspective.
Thank you, Pippa. So the way the paper is broken out is it first talks about some of the issues that we've been observing over the last 5-6 years, and what are the types of things that we can do about it. We've observed, and many of you, that prices have risen over time, and so we spend some time in the paper digesting that and breaking it down and thinking about what is infrastructure's role in sort of bringing things back to normal. I want to begin by talking a bit about prices in general, because you often hear in sort of the news and the narrative that electricity prices are rising, but it's really important to be clear about what prices we're talking about. This chart shows the various components of the household electricity bill. So this is the bill that households pay, but also smaller businesses are paying. There's the energy component, which is sort of the cost of making electricity. Then there's the transmission component and the distribution component, which are the costs of delivering that electricity to households over time. And you can see they make up different portions of the bill, and they've been changing over time. What we observe in the paper is that since 2014 or so, up to about 2025, after we adjust for inflation, the price of electricity for households and smaller businesses was relatively flat or even declining over time. But in 2026, that trend sort of reversed, and we've seen rising prices. But again, thinking about the components, breaking it down, what's been driving that? Well, some of that's been due to increases related to what we call the regulated sectors. So things that are regulated by the Commerce Commission, transmission and distribution. Some of that is related to the costs of maintaining and renewing the assets that were built in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s in the system are starting to come forward, and those providers need to renew those. And the Commerce Commission has given them sort of the ability to raise prices a little bit to cover those costs. So those are regulated utilities. a lot of the commentary you hear out there focuses on the blue part, the cost of producing electricity, the component that electricity generators focus on, and that is indeed one of the areas that has had sort of some real volatility over the last 6 or 7 years. And so I wanted to zoom in on that blue part by looking at this chart. This chart shows effectively the wholesale price, which is the price that certain electricity users pay directly, versus relative to the long-run cost of building, operating, and fueling electricity plants. The blue line is the wholesale price expectations, and the gray bar is what it costs those entities to build and produce electricity. I want to point out two things on this chart. The first is thinking about who exactly is paying this blue line price. Because when we talk about household prices increasing, right, I showed you there's 3 different components. The people who are exposed to the volatility in this blue line, this wholesale price, are really large users of electricity, right? So, and industrial users. So they're ones that are not necessarily they're plugged in directly to generation or have very small transmission. They use high voltage electricity. So they are exposed to this wholesale volatility. Households and businesses are relatively shielded from this volatility from price contracts. If you think about that chart I showed you earlier, that you don't see huge volatility from year to year, and that's because retailers, large businesses, can settle on long-term price contracts to shield them from that volatility and rising prices. And so when you hear about sort of rising wholesale prices, the most direct impact is on large industrial consumers, not necessarily in the immediate term on households. But if we think about what this blue line is reflecting, the sort of cost of or the price of electricity, and the gray bar as being sort of the cost to produce electricity, what we observe is that since 2010, and even prior to that, this blue line has been very close to the gray line, indicating that the cost of producing and building electricity was very close to what was actually being charged. And something happened in 2019 where the price of electricity went well above what it cost to build and operate. And so we asked the question in the paper, what is the reason for this, and why have those prices been stubbornly above that long run relationship we observed prior to 2019? So just to digest this a little bit more, it's important to understand how New Zealand generates electricity based upon the type of fuel sources. This chart shows basically the share of our total electricity that's generated from different sources. The sort of main player for New Zealand for a long time has been hydroelectricity. It is a reliable and flexible source of generating electricity, but one of the issues is it's subject to dry period risk. When it doesn't rain, the lakes are relatively low and the rivers aren't flowing. So sometimes you have to think about how you manage your hydro lakes in order to ensure that there's enough supply. Then there's geothermal, which has been a real success story over the past decade or so, where we've been really adding more geothermal electricity. It is a really important source for this system because it is reliable and it's also cheap to operate. More recently, renewable sources from wind and solar have been becoming an important mix of the energy system. They are cheap to operate because the sun is cheap, the sun is free, the wind is free, but they suffer from sort of the same intermittency issues that hydro can suffer from. And so the system has traditionally relied on what is called thermal generation by gas and coal to cover the shortfalls or to cover those intermittency issues that are inherent to hydro and renewable sources. They are flexible, but the downside to those is that they are relatively costly to operate. And that's what this chart shows. And this sort of explains the dynamic that we've been seeing since 2019. What this chart shows is the estimated cost of building and operating an electricity plant across New Zealand by different types of generation. This is the blue bar, and the long run and the short run cost of fueling it. So this is like, the cost of buying gas or coal or the sun or wind. You can see that sun and wind has no cost because it's free, and a relatively high price for the thermal generation plant. Back in 2015, the cost of building and operating solar and wind, and to some extent geothermal plants, was higher than it was it was quite expensive, and it was basically on par with gas and coal plants, right? And so what we had in that system back then, even prior to that, was you had hydro, which was sort of the biggest player, but then there was room for gas and coal plants to operate and make money in this system because the sort of other competitors, wind and solar, were about as expensive. Over time, though, solar and wind have become much cheaper to operate and build relative to gas and coal plants. And those thermal plants, which are flexible, have gotten more expensive to run. And so what we've been seeing since 2019 is that those existing plants that we built a long time ago that were sort of that flexible generation kind of became uncompetitive in the electricity market over time. And what we see is that those plants have been closing over time, right? So if you think about the system that we have, when we rely a lot on hydro generation and more increasingly on renewables, you do have that intermittency risk. But since 2000, roughly 2000, over time, that flexible firming generation that's come from thermal electricity has become kind of uncompetitive, because in order to keep that plant around, in dry years, the prices need to be very high in order for those generators to produce a return, because when it's not a dry year, I've shown in the previous charts, those plants can't necessarily sell power at a competitive price. But when those dry years do happen, you also need that capacity to be online. And what we observed in 2019 is that not only was the price of providing that firming generation high, much higher than it used to be, but just that capacity was markedly less available. So when those dry year times did happen, it was a real tight squeeze. The other thing that's been happening is the developments around gas, because gas is one of the key ways that we fuel some of these thermal generation plants. This chart shows the gas production over time and the associated forecasts with this. So from 1990 to about 2015, we had pretty plentiful gas in New Zealand, and it was relatively consistent. Since 2019, the amount of production that we have for gas has declined precipitously, but not only that, but it was a surprise to a lot of people. The forecast kind of thought that we would have more gas for probably another 10 years or so, and we've kind of quickly needed to readjust our priors that the decline is upon us faster than we initially thought, right? And so that had effects on the price of gas, the power of thermal generation. What you observe in this chart is that the price of gas across all different types of consumers has increased markedly since 2019. And the way that's flowed through to electricity generation is that the price to run those thermal generation plants has increased significantly over time. As a result. And so when there is a dry year risk, the prices have to go much higher to bring that supply online. And so this has sort of brought out a key implication of our report, which is thinking about how we coordinate and we have a system that adapts over time to make those sort of price shocks less pointy, less difficult in the future. And Pippa will talk about that at the end. And so when we observe that prices are well higher than the cost of building and operating electricity, the economist in me basically immediately says, well, there's profits to be made here. We should be seeing people wanting to get into this space. And that is kind of what we're observing over the last few years. This chart shows the amount of electricity supply that is committed and actively pursued to be built in New Zealand over the next 10 years. Committed means they're actually going to build it. Actively pursued means that they're going for resource consent and other consent and doing the planning and design work. So they're quite far along in the planning process here. And you can see, in a system where we have, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, something like 45 terawatts of electricity total demand right now, adding an additional 6 terawatts by 2030 is a pretty significant increase in electricity supply over time. And so the question we ask in the paper is, well, if the path back to lower prices is adding more supply over time, what are the barriers to bringing that new supply online? Which is, in one area that we see as being quite important, is policy, stable policy to give confidence to long-term investment, which Pippa will talk about at the end. And the good news is what we see recently, that long-term expectations for prices are starting to trend back towards the long-run cost of building and operating electricity over time. And so this is sort of a monitoring brief for the Commission and others in the electricity sector, that we're starting to see this development over time. But we will update our sort of thinking on what's needed as more information related to future prices and long-term costs of building. We get more information on those. So I want to turn next to the long-term challenges of the system, and we see that as being a space where the Commission can add a real value in terms of the perspective in this world. And that is how we achieve and how we're going to need to invest in electricity for net zero. The background and context here is that New Zealand has a legislative requirement to meet net zero emissions, except for biogenetic methane, by year 2050. And the question is how we're going to achieve that. The Climate Change Commission puts out different pathways for meeting that net zero goal. And all of those pathways suggest that electricity is going to be bearing a large part, or playing a very important role in meeting that sector. And that's because the way that we power things right now in our economy will need to shift towards electricity instead of fossil fuels and coal. What this chart shows is the demand for electricity, the projections for demand for electricity from the climate change fourth emissions budget pathway, based on where that demand is going to come from. And you can see that, the teal parts, the orange parts, and the light orange parts are kind of steady as she goes in the next 30 years. But the real growth is coming from areas which are what we would call policy-led demand. So things like EV demand, the switching of fossil fuel powered vehicles to electric vehicles, but also new demand for things like data centers. How are we going to power large energy users in the future? If we want to meet our net zero emissions goals, that needs to occur with electricity. And so the Commission's real addition to this space is thinking about what is that investment number going to need to be for electricity over the long run, and that is what we call our forward guidance in the National Infrastructure Plan. These are long-run forecasts for investment spending in order to meet those long-run infrastructure needs in a sustainable way. It's based upon sort of macro drivers of demand, things like population growth, income growth, technology, and decarbonization. So how are those going to drive investment, which we do for the overall system, and then we look at individual sectors. Looking at the electricity system, it's one of the sectors that we believe is going to require a significant amount of investment over the next 30 years, primarily as a result of decarbonization. You can see the renewal requirements are quite large. That's reflecting, the need to renew assets that were built 30, 40 years ago. But the new big improvement in driver demand is the need to meet decarbonization demand, which we expect to add a total of $26 billion over the next 30 years, above sort of business as usual baseline demand. That's about $835 million per year in additional investment. Most of this investment, as you can see, is front-loaded in the next 10 to 15 years, right? So if we want to meet decarbonization goals, we're going to need to start switching fuels over the next 10, 15 years, and in order to keep prices down, investment in electricity is going to need to follow suit. And so the question we ask in the paper is, how are we progressing? What we see is that there is belief in the electricity generator space that there will be significant growth in electricity demand over time. However, not necessarily at the level that is required to meet decarbonization. So this chart is similar to the one I showed earlier, which is the intentions from the electricity generators to build electricity over time, committed and actively pursued, compared with the Climate Change Commission's sort of pathways for meeting our net zero emissions goals and a baseline. So the blue bar here shows a level of investment that would need to be built to meet sort of business as usual demand, but not an amount that would need it to be built to meet net zero. The black bar shows what is required to meet that demand for decarbonization. And what we see is that the orange bar is quite a lot higher than the baseline business as usual demand. So developers do believe that decarbonization will drive significant investment over the future, but they're not quite diving in headfirst at the level that would be required for decarbonization. And why is that? One of the key challenges we see in the system is the importance of policy certainty and coherence. Generators will not build electricity unless they have confidence that the demand will be there over time. And because decarbonization is largely driven by policy, it has a significant impact on that demand, right? A key example of this is the New Zealand emissions trading scheme, which is designed to incentivize fuel switching from fossil fuels to electricity. This chart shows, the blue line, what the actual price is for New Zealand units in the emissions trading scheme. The orange shows what the price would have to be in order to be consistent with a net zero target. So basically what this says is that prices would need to be a fair amount higher in order to generate the level of switching that is required to meet decarbonization goals. Not only that, if you look at the blue line here, it is quite volatile, right? So if you are relying on the emissions trading scheme to incentivize fuel switching and therefore create the demand for electricity over time, this volatility and this relatively low price creates uncertainty about what that demand will be in the future. And so you can see why the generators aren't, fully jumping in headfirst on a decarbonization story. The other challenge that we highlight in our work for the long term is thinking about how we handle dry year and peak year demand situations. This chart's a little bit complicated, but I'll walk you through it. Effectively, what it shows is over a period of a year, were prices at the really low end of the spectrum or the high end of the spectrum or in the middle? What percentile were the prices at? What we see in sort of 2016 is that prices generally landed in sort of the 25th to 75th percentile, right? So there was not a lot of fluctuation and volatility in the price. Over time, what we've seen is that as more and more renewables have come online, which are very cheap to generate electricity, what that means is that for some parts of the year, the prices are extremely low for some parts, but then when there's intermittency, they have the risk of being potentially quite high, right? And so the question is, going over the long term, if we're going to be relying more on renewable energy, how can we handle that? And one way that we can do that, we argue in the paper, is thinking about the importance of adaptability and flexibility, particularly in this transition period, which Pippa will talk about. Now, take it away.
Thank you, Graham. Hi. So Graham sort of illustrated, some of those challenges that arise as electricity demand grows and the system becomes more increasingly reliant on renewable generation. But we see four interconnected themes that are important if New Zealand is to deliver affordable energy, reliable supply, and lower emissions. So our first observation is that policy certainty matters. The energy system is highly interconnected. So policy, regulatory, and operational changes in one area can have consequences elsewhere. And because the energy infrastructure is built over decades, investors need confidence in future demand and the direction of policy. For example, electricity demand growth has been slower than expected, as Graham pointed out, with electric vehicle uptake and industrial fuel switching progressing much more slowly than has been anticipated. But at the same time, there have been uncertainties around the extent of government interventions to address security of supply, for example, particularly since 2004, with strategic reserves, diesel peakers, battery projects, and other initiatives over time. But clear and consistent signals around decarbonisation, including an effective emissions trading scheme, as Graham has described earlier, help support investment decisions in the long term. So recent planning reforms and efforts to prioritise energy infrastructure are also positive developments. Our second observation is that increasing system capacity remains critical for the sector. So building more lower-cost generation should put downward pressure on prices over the long term, while also supporting economic growth and electrification. So Graham noted the scale of investment needed to meet decarbonisation goals, around 26 billion above business as usual levels by 2050, and which averages around 835 million per annum in new generation and associated network capacity increases for the next 10-15 years. That's really quite large, and it's a particular challenge for the sector to meet decarbonisation goals. But wholesale electricity prices have remained above the cost of supply for much of the period. since 2019. So this raises questions about how quickly new supply can be brought to the market and whether there are barriers slowing investment and impacting competition. At the same time, we should expect greater price volatility. Price volatility will be a feature going forward in a highly renewable system. So the challenge isn't necessarily eliminating price volatility, but it's ensuring that the system can manage it effectively. The third area is around a renewable electricity system requires greater flexibility in responding to those demand and supply pressures. So balancing supply to demand will become more challenging as generation becomes even more weather dependent. So we're likely to see periods of both very, very high and very, very low prices, as Graham's last chart showed. This increases the value of tools such as demand response, battery storage, flexibility in managing industrial load and consumer use, and other technologies that can shift consumption away from peak periods. We're already seeing good progress from the sector organisations and organisations like ECA in developing such approaches. Looking ahead, looking at the long term, we see that tools will be important, including infrastructure and non-infrastructure solutions, regulatory and market settings, and improving markets for financial and contract products to help generators and consumers manage exposure to volatile prices and risk. And our final observation is that the transition will continue to need active coordination across government, regulators, and industry so that it can keep adapting the system to be able to respond to such issues and pressures. So in our paper, we also show that maintaining alignment across that sector will become increasingly important because the benefits of providing clear policy signals and monitoring progress and improving visibility of market information and identifying emerging risks earlier all contribute to improving how the system operates. So in many respects, we're already seeing some of this reflected in recent government priorities and the work of regulators. But overall, we suggest that the transition is not simply about building more generation. Success will depend on 4 things working together: stable policy settings, investment in new capacity, a more flexible and adaptable system, and a strong coordination across the sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Pippa. Just to wrap up quickly here, just this work, it will feed into some of our future policy work into government, but we consider, we talked about this being a journey, so we're going to continue to develop, our maturity and understanding of issues within the sector over time and use it in our overall work programs. So really appreciate the opportunity, and we can close up now and turn it back to you, Harvey.
Pippa and Graham, thank you so much for such a impressively comprehensive presentation. It was really, really great. And at the end there, I think you started to kind of preface some of the questions I know that I have and that others that are on the call might have today. So if I can just indulge with a couple of questions of curiosity, and then we'll open it up. I see we've got Jonathan here today, and then at the end, I'll ask Ernie for a couple of wrap-ups. And these are questions just reflecting, I suppose, the conversation that's out there in the ether on electricity. And you mentioned industry structure a bit, and obviously one of the questions that goes around a lot these days is the role of the gentailers in terms of concentration and also vertical integration with them. So I'm not sure if I should be asking you or the Commerce Commission this question, but in terms of your thinking, how much does the structure of the industry, especially at the generation end, matter? Is it something that you think needs to be looked at any more than it has already?
Do you want me to take that one?
Sure, you can go for it. Yeah.
Well, obviously, there's been a lot of commentary in terms of that. We also noted in our paper the OECD in their economic survey released this year identifies some issues in terms of that. Our paper, we don't necessarily delve into the whys and wherefore or detailed design or structural elements. We're just pointing out what we see as factors affecting some of the underlying issues that we're seeing. Would that be a fair thing to say, Graham?
Yeah, I guess what I'd say here is we highlight as something that should be looked into as a broader area for thinking about What is a potential barrier to bringing on that new supply over time? I guess what we observed, though, I just would say one thing is I showed that chart earlier, which is the price of electricity has largely tracked the cost of actually building it over time. So um, I think if things like the market structure, need to be tweaked over time, it would be something that, has been sort of brought forward by this transition period that we're currently in, rather than an issue that's been around for, decades or so. So, yeah, I think this highlights also the what Pippa talked about, which is, the different players in the system, in the role that various, we are the Infrastructure Commission, but as you noted, the Commerce Commission and the Electricity Authority has, an important role to play to think about some of those competition issues.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And just my last question before I open it up. I was just curious as to how much you've sort of gleaned from international experience and to what degree that it's relevant. I mean, if I look at places like, this is not an exhaustive list, but Spain, UK, Texas, South Australia, California, Germany, with things like, they've got a program called Energy Wind, and they have an issue called Dunkelfloat, when the sun ain't shining and the wind ain't blowing. And there's been some challenges there, and maybe those are unfair examples because they're probably moving from a massively fossil fuel based system to a sustainable one, and we have a different energy mix, as you pointed out in one of your charts. Are there things that you can take from those international examples that are relevant to us, that we can sort of leap ahead and maybe avoid some of those security reliability challenges there have been overseas?
Great question, Harvey. Think about this. Do you have anything you want to jump in on?
Dunkelflaut is a feature of a number of different systems around the world. We haven't necessarily concentrated on some of the learnings in terms of that. We've been trying to describe what's going on here and some of the issues that are raised, but certainly the learnings from other regulators and other countries and how they've dealt with that.
I think one thing that I would say is that last year the Infrastructure Commission undertook some work benchmarking our networks across not just electricity, but all our infrastructure networks across other countries. And I think one of the key lessons that we pulled from that was that no country kind of has the full answer on every single network, right? There are bits that other countries do well, and there are lessons to take from that. One area that I think we picked up as we were doing some of this research is that, New Zealand's electricity system is held in relatively high regard, in some jurisdictions, and so, to the extent that there are issues within the current system, that they are, as Pippa points out, they're not big silver bullets, right? They're relatively small things that, we might, I agree, Harvey, that, we could look to other countries for those, smaller fixes.
Yeah, I guess it's the challenge of the transition, really. We're already very, very highly renewable, and that creates, as we mentioned, sort of some unique challenges for New Zealand in terms of how it uses its firming and thermal supplies, and how it balances the system and what changes are needed to doing that. So what we can learn from other countries is really important in terms of what has worked, what's encouraged investment, what's encouraged demand response and technologies that actually can help manage those kind of transition issues and the security of supply matters.
No, thank you very much. I'm really curious as to how some of those experiences might be replicable. I think of Spain, as I understand, has a pretty high renewable energy grid, and they've had some real challenges when the thing flips, if that's the right word for it, and sometimes that's because of too much generation, not too little. I'm mindful, for reasons which I can't quite explain, that we have a pretty small audience today, but Jonathan Kay is online, and so Jonathan, are there any questions you'd like to ask the team directly while we've got you here as well?
I came into the discussion kind of quite late, so probably not really, other than an observation and a pet peeve of mine. We should be careful how we use the words energy and electricity, right? And I'll talk to this a little bit next week, right? So whilst we like to talk of ourselves as an energy market, it's an electricity market, and without getting context is so important. It's exactly what you were talking about from learning from other countries. Like, lots of people are doing lots of different things. The only place you want to go for learning at the moment is the Netherlands, because they rushed into transition donkey deep and broke the system, right? But everybody else is starting from very different starting points, and so you've got to be careful. And I think it's the same for energy. Until you really look at this thing as the whole energy system, which includes liquid fuels, because that's the biggest kind of energy source in this country, you won't go anywhere near to solving it. We get very focused and transfixed on the wholesale market, right? And it's only a tiny piece of this whole puzzle, right? And so, you know, like I just see everybody doing that. We're actually heading to a world of more affordable energy, but there's no doubt in my mind that electricity will be more expensive. Has to be, right? And some of the things we talk about, like I don't quite understand how you go, we do want to encourage more capacity, but if you put it in a real terms, like you want overbuild, therefore you want some people in the mix of that to take a low or no return or a loss on that. It's not that's the conundrum, right? That I see for us going forward. And I think there's a role for government, not from a policy setting, but from what it did the last time we built the system out. It underwrote it. Yeah.
Thank you, John.
Yeah,
It's a great observation.
If I could just add on to this, I think what you're highlighting here is what exactly we're touching on the paper, particularly around demand certainty, because in a market where there has to be incentive to invest, there is not a world where generators will build to make a loss, right? And so either you sit in that market and you think about what will be required to lead to the demand so that that the capacity can be built and be profitable, or you think about a complete change to the overall system. I think we're basic. I think we're saying roughly the same thing here. The only thing I'd sort of highlight is when we look at the energy infrastructure that was built, 40, 50 years ago, as Pippa talked about, it was built well in advance of demand. That's what we observed. Prices were very low.
That's not true though, right? When you go back to the golden period, right, starting in the 50s post World War II, right, we actually were behind the 8 ball. We were in a very similar position to where we are now, right? Okay, like government, because government was the upstream entity, there wasn't anybody else. They underestimated demand and they were chasing it for a long time, right? That is why we have such a sort of pervasive load management regime, and not pervasive. It's we built load management and we incentivized it in New Zealand because we were trying to hold back this, and then we got ahead of it and we used it to kind of grow because we actually got good at it and we realized we had abundance. Yeah. So I think when you go back enough to look at that and get that context, it helps you. But we certainly weren't. We do need to build ahead of demand. But at the moment, we have eaten into the security of the system because the wholesale market doesn't. The wholesale market doesn't provide security, right? It's surprising that it's taken us so long to realize it, but it doesn't. And so we're not that different to where we were in the late 40s, early 50s, for my mind, right? And we have to find a way to get ahead of it and then to sell it, right? And I think this is this difference in mindset of like back then we had copious amounts of cheap electricity. Renewable wasn't even in the mix then, and we used it to bring energy-intensive industry to New Zealand to create jobs and build communities. We're sort of back in that cycle, right? It sort of means that government has to be a little more than policy setting. I went to something a while back with, and I'm sorry if I'm dominating this, but with, you know, all the various political parties, and you know, you had ACT there and a very market purist, but the guy there had been involved in the broadband rollout, right? The ultra fast fibre. That's sort of where government needs to be, because it's sort of transitioning into a new space, and it underpinned it and gave us a great outcome, and didn't actually take a lot of risk with that, in my mind. You know, it took the uptake risk away, which is what you're talking about. But if you go back to the earlier point around history, we started our big build of our system behind the 8 ball, and then we got ahead of it, right?
Hey, Jonathan, thank you.
Yeah.
Pippa, any further
Thank you,
comments?
Jonathan. Yeah, no, interesting observations, Jonathan. And, you know, we can see opportunities and would encourage, you know, discussion. And we were hoping that our paper would actually contribute to some of that discussion. And as a starting point, there is a lot more sort of technical experts in terms of the system and how different parts work together. But we've seen some there's some emerging forums that actually have some really, really good discussion and debate around what's needed, how to navigate the transition, and what the system needs in the long term, and what New Zealanders need in the long term.
Cool. I see a little bit of a segue here. What actually intrigued me about one of your charts when I looked at that big build period, I think it said that we were investing about 2.5% of GDP during that time on generation, and I thought that's interesting. That's not so far away from what the states were investing in the Apollo program at its peak, which gives it some sort of a sense of scale. There's a bit of a moonshot mentality going there. And as it so happens, my colleague here, Ernie Newman, was quite heavily involved in the separation of telecom into Spark and Chorus and what we've got right now. And Jonathan, we were just talking before the webinar started about it's interesting how the government actually divested itself of a state-owned monopoly and created a competitive infrastructure system where we're all benefiting these days. And that's probably a glib summary of it. But Ernie, is it a good time now maybe for a few reflecting comments from you?
Thanks, Harvey. Yeah, I'll keep them brief. I'm not going to start going down the broadband route because I think most people would say the broadband restructuring was a success, whereas the jury is still out somewhat on the electricity one, and that may be a subject for a separate seminar at some point in time. But look, thanks guys for the presentation. It was absolutely packed with information, and I learned a hell of a lot out of it. So thank you very much for the time you've put into that. It continues my main outtake from the series so far, which is the problems we're facing in this industry are not so much infrastructure as industry structure. We've got ourselves into a very complicated, convoluted structure, and when I looked at Pippa's last slide, I think it was, with the 4 requirements, which I abbreviated very quickly: policy certainty, more and cheaper generation, adaptability, system coordination. 2 of those at least are very much tied in with the convoluted structure this industry is in. And when I looked at, I think it was your slide 8, there must be something over 100 entities, all of them involved in this industry. All of them with a CEO to be fed, a legal team, an accounting team, an operations team, a comms team, and so on. The need for a profile, and it just seems that the industry has become an extraordinarily complex beast. And I think back to the days of the Bradford reforms in the 2000s, and I'm still trying to get my head around what problem exactly Max Bradford was trying to solve, because I suspect a lot of it was philosophical rather than real. But you know, I spent a very small period of my early career with the Ministry of Works and Development, as it was then, 18 months I had with it, and they had a a very big electricity division. Across the road was the New Zealand Electricity Department. And between the two of them, those two seemed to very effectively get on with building power stations and putting more generation in place. And the engineers were actually, the best engineers in New Zealand were very happy working for the government, and they got on and did stuff. There was a lot less talking and a lot more building. And I think we have lost something somewhere along the way by turning this into a corporate structure. Now we seem to have an industry that does a lot more talking and somewhat less building. So, you know, at the risk of getting a whole lot of hate mail on social media calling me a communist, I actually think there is a very good case for some re-centralisation of the electricity industry, so that preferably engineers rather than politicians can get on with making sensible decisions and do what needs to be done. Politicians should get out of the way, find the people who really understand the industry, some of whom we've seen on this series already, and just let them do it. So Graham and Pippa, thank you very much. Excellent presentation. We're putting together through the Wellbeing Project a very good collection of data on this topic, and I look forward to a continuation next week.
Thanks very much for those comments, Ernie, and I won't ask the government officials on the line to respond to those. I think they're a good summation of what we've heard so far across a number of speakers, and we will continue to build the case. Just looking forward, and it's great that Jonathan, you are here because you are our next speaker next Wednesday, and there's a little bit of an overview on some of Jonathan's positions. I don't think there could be a better person from a qualification point of view and experience point of view to talk to us in this series. So Jonathan, we're really looking forward to you having the floor next week. Just join the same link, same bat time, same bat channel to come on to this presentation again. Just beyond Jonathan next week, we still have a good book of presenters which are there coming through right through to the 4th of November, which is coincidentally 3 days before the election, talking to us about their perspectives on the 4 questions that we've been putting to all of our speakers. So please, if you haven't already, sign up for that, get on board, tell everyone, tell your friends, tell your family to tune in. All right, that's pretty much it for today. So thanks again so much, Graham and Pippa, for the time and the considerable effort that would have gone into that presentation. I hope that you've used it before and you can use it again, because it certainly deserves to be shared widely. And to generate the kind of conversations we've had today. Thank you, Ernie, for co-hosting with me, and thank you, Jonathan, for your incisive and really well-informed comments and questions as well. So I'm just going to close the webinar with a karakia. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te atawhai o te tātou iriki, o ihu karaiti, me te araha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga, ki te wairua tapu ake ake. Āmene. Thanks, everybody. Have a lovely day. See you soon.